I got a lot that I could say. One of my favorite things, as you know, is to watch people try to find the rhythm. You all found it. That was nice. I always like it. Sometimes it's a longer walk than others, but you got there. That was good. That was spectacular leading. It was so great, and I loved how you were looking at each other at times, kind of helping each other out. It was just fun. I don't know why I would stand up and preach after that. I do know that if at any point you feel like you're getting bored, just start doing the signs. Awesome, God. Go for it. And that way it'll be sort of not only a nonverbal cue for me to maybe speed things up, but it'll also help you stay awake while I'm preaching. That'll be lovely. We are focusing this morning on the awesomeness of God. And not the awesomeness of God's scope and size, though that's true, but the awesomeness of God's love and the promise of that love that leads to life, and not a narrow way in which it leads to life. One of the things that we delight in are these really wide margins of grace that we believe is found in the truth of who God is. And so we're gonna keep trying to understand that more fully in our lives as we look at a passage from Luke's gospel. We heard already from Recollection chapter 21 about no more tears, and now we're going to read this passage that might be familiar to many of us, but listen to what God has to say to us in Luke chapter 22, verses 14 through 20. When the hour came, Jesus took his place at the table and the apostles there with him. And Jesus said to them, I've eagerly desired to eat this Passover meal with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat this meal until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And then Jesus took a cup, and after giving thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke the bread and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And Jesus did the same thing with the cup after supper, saying, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant, sealed in my blood, shed for the forgiveness of sins. May God bless us as we open ourselves to God's word. We had a great day yesterday as our church was a part of a gun buyback event that Cornerstone Fellowship and our church partnered with the Livermore Police Department on. And as I was there, it was a great time. And I parenthetically would just say it's not a program that's trying to get the guns out of the hands of criminals. It's really a public service. As many people, almost 100 guns, were brought by people who just found themselves with guns in their homes. Maybe someone in their family left them one, and they just were uncomfortable having it in their home. And so oftentimes people don't know what to do with that. And so just great for them to have this service that the police department provides to dispose of those guns properly and safely and to give people that peace of mind. But in the midst of that, I was sort of wearing two hats. I was the pastor of our church that was co-sponsoring this, providing funds, but I'm also a chaplain in the police department, and so I knew a lot of the people that were there working. And one police officer I didn't know, I was meeting yesterday, and I was talking to him, and his son was there with him. And as I was talking there with him, one of the guys that I knew said, oh, well, this is Steve. He's the chaplain of our department, and he's a pastor at the church. And it always is a little awkward when someone sort of outs me in that way, because I'm not sure how that's going to go. You know, you tell someone you're a pastor, it can go one of two ways, really. I mean, it could be a great thing, or it could be a less than great thing. And so I was waiting for the response, and fortunately, the response immediately from this guy was to look at his son and go, oh my gosh, tell Pastor Steve what you know. Well, where's that going to go? But without missing a beat, this young man, couldn't have been more than 5 years old, starts reciting all of the books in the Bible, like every one of them. It was awesome. It was impressive. In the interest of confession and full disclosure, I don't think I could do it. It was really good. And so I was simply trying to engage with this young boy. And I said, oh, that is so good. What's your favorite book in the New Testament? Blank stare. Looked at me like, had no idea what I was talking about. Not even sure he knew there was an Old and a New Testament. And I thought to myself, now look, to be clear, he was young. It was super cute. It was great what he did. But it sort of highlighted exactly what I want us to think about this morning, because it's what we don't ever want to be. right? Those who simply know how to restate words and not really understand what those words mean in our lives, right? We don't want to be people who talk about these beliefs, but then when someone says, well, what does that mean? Have blank stares, right? We're trying to really honestly and with integrity be open to what God says to us, to what God says is true about God and to what God says is true about us. And so this morning we're going to be looking at that. And some of you know that I love that in psychology, this idea of memory has three components to it. Memory has three components, right? There's the encoding component, there's the storing component, and then there's the retrieval component. In order for memory to be memory, it needs to kind of have those three things. And the encoding component of memory is when information that's kind of taken from outside the world provides us with this information, and we take that in, and it allows through our senses to sort of affect chemically and physically. It sort of creates chemically and physically an imprint somehow in our brains, and it's sort of encoded. And that's that first part in the process of memory. And in the first stage, we sort of have to change the information into something that we can then store, right? Which happens in our brains. The second stage in the process of memory, in order for memory to be real, is that it's stored somewhere in our brain. And it's a fascinating, those of you who study the brain more than I do, it's just this fascinating process, the way the brain works. But once something's encoded and once it's stored in our brain, in order for memory as a process, as a reality to be complete, it then needs to be retrieved. Right? There's this process of locating and returning to our consciousness that which has been encoded and stored. It needs to be retrieved, which is probably, for many of us, a lot easier said than done at times. It's that retrieval part that we have a hard time with. It really can be easier said than done when we want to retrieve the things that are stored in our brains. Or maybe I'm the only one. Anybody have a hard time from time to time remembering things? There's a couple of us. I mean, maybe you can relate to walking into a room and going, why did I come in here? Or looking for something that's actually in your pocket or in your purse or on your head, or wondering where you were going. And then there's that lovely person, Danielle, who always tells us, oh, just walk in and out of a door jamb. The threshold has some magical portal that takes you to the memory. No, it doesn't. It doesn't do that. And it's just now more maddening. Or it's like, oh, it's on the tip of my tongue. No, it's not. It's not. It's somewhere stuck between storage and retrieval. That's where it is. What do you think are the most common things that are forgotten? Names, glasses, keys, answers to tests, right? Passwords. Yeah, oh yeah. Where you are, where you're going. We are a forgetful people. And we've come up with all kinds of ways to help us remember things. There's that old school, my grandma used to say, tie a string around your finger. That was one way to remember things. Some of us live life with Post-it notes all over our computer screen. That would be me. Others of us write things on our wrists or our palms. That would be Pastor Dania. A lot of us thought Pastor Dania was tattooed, but evidently she just has a lot to do today. See what I'm saying? There's others that set alarms in our phones. We go into our calendars, and all of a sudden, a year ago, we set an alarm. We're like, oh my gosh, what is this supposed to be reminding me of? We are a forgetful people. And the thing is, God knows this about us. And so regularly throughout the story of God's interaction with God's people, God has made a point to tell people what and how to remember. Right? In Deuteronomy chapter 7, God says, remember well what God has done for you. In Deuteronomy 24, remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God redeemed you, saved you from there. The psalmist writes that remember the wonders that God has done. In Isaiah, we read about God's promises, and Isaiah says, remember this, fix it in your mind and take it to heart. There's these places where we're constantly being told what and ultimately how to remember. Memory has always played a critical role in the community of faith, and it's memory that I think is central to this passage in Luke chapter 22. And it's central in two ways. The first is that it's central in that it's not some interesting coincidence that they're eating the Passover meal. I don't know what your favorite meal is, but ultimately in the people of God, in the Jewish tradition, this Passover meal is this centrally important meal. And it's not some coincidence that Jesus and his followers are sharing that meal together. The Passover meal originates in the book of Exodus, and it speaks of God's deliverance of God's people, those that were enslaved and are now freed and liberated from that slavery, from that bondage. God instructs the whole congregation of Israel how to eat, what to eat, how quickly to eat, and then we know the story, right? There's ultimately a sacrifice that's made, and blood from that sacrifice is put over on your door, and then in the night, God is going to come and pass over those houses where there's the blood there and save those that are within that house. This story of deliverance and sort of being marked by, included by God's deliverance. And then it's after that night that the Egyptians release the Jews, they beg them to leave, and from there we know that they enter into this journey into the promised land that God has for them. The Passover meal celebrates that deliverance, celebrates how God was at work in and through their lives, and we're told that the meal is a meal of remembrance. Well, Jesus and his disciples were gathering to do just that in Luke 22, to remember that deliverance, to remember God's delivering God's people out of slavery, and remembering the people that had gone before them that had lived in that same promise, that same truth. And in many respects, that's what we do today on All Saints' Day. We remember people who have gone before us, right? We sort of know that the truth of the good news of God's deliverance, God's saving us, this idea that life is what follows life, is good news for us, but it also is good news for those who we have known. And most of us have lost someone close to us in our lives. Many of us have lost someone close to us this past year. And to be honest, I'm not going to stand up here and try to make sense of all of the ways in which we lose people, the sadness that we feel. It doesn't always make sense to me. I don't always have as good a response as I think people think I'm supposed to have when they ask me why certain things happen or why things have gone the way they've gone. But what I do know is that there is a real power that's found in the encoding, in the storing, and the retrieving of information, the memories that we have, especially as it pertains to those that we love. Because the truth is that memories not only affect and shape who we are, but they help remind us of who we are. And if you look around, you know that we do this. You can see monuments that are made, that are formally put up in communities or in cities. We see monuments that sort of pop up on the sides of roads as people mark a place with flowers or with a cross or with candles. We create monuments at times in our own lives, in our own homes. We wear pins or we wear bands or we get tattoos that are in memory of the people that have meant a lot to us. There's a sacredness and a power found in that memory. And just as Jesus is celebrating the Passover meal with his disciples, remembering who they were, all around us, we're trying to hold on to our memories so that we don't forget who we are. And really whose we are, even as we hold on to the memories of our loved ones so that we don't forget who they were. So memory is not only central to this passage in its context, but it's also central in its content. Right? What Jesus says as he institutes this communion meal, this Lord's Supper. We've heard it many times in verse 19. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Christ's words envision a time when he won't be with the disciples the way they wanted him to be there. When what they will have to hold on to of him is a memory. Something that they have encoded and stored and will need to retrieve. See, Jesus knows what's going to happen and knows that that memory will sustain them, will remind them of this new reality that Easter proclaims. And what we celebrate at this table, what this new Passover meal is intended to point to is not the darkness of the cross. Like, it's not about darkness. It's about the light of an empty tomb. It's about an empty tomb that proclaims that life is what follows life. And in sharing this meal, we choose to be those who lean into a hope that speaks to us and sustains us as we face the mystery of death. And I'm not going to try to oversimplify it. This past week, I sat with a couple who is living in the midst of unthinkable tragedy. And I was brought in to sit with them. They welcomed me into their home, and I just listened. And as I was listening to them just from a broken place pour themselves out, and I could quickly see that they were spiritually broken. They were just so confused and wanting to hear something bigger than what they were dealing with. And they didn't go to church. They were spiritually curious. They were asking me questions, and I was smart enough to not try to give them answers. Right? I was smart enough to try to talk about some plan. And again, I get it. But if the tragedy that many that we know have had to deal with is a part of some plan, that is a pretty lame plan. That can't be the plan. So I didn't talk about some simplistic response to the complex emotion they were feeling. What I simply said was what I hope to be true. And that is that God's promise is that life is what follows life. That God's promise, the proclamation of Easter, the new meal that we celebrate is that life is what triumphs. And life is what follows life. I just believe we are a resurrection people. You and I, we are created to daily live in the reality of resurrection. And the Christian hope is that the new life that's brought into us through Christ's death and resurrection is that death no longer has the last word in life. Not in your life, not in my life, not in the lives of those that we love. The promise of the resurrection is that while we die physically, we live eternally in the reality of love. Gathering around this table speaks to that reality, reminds us of that reality. Because we're told in Luke's gospel later in 2 chapters, in chapter 24, that the very first time the disciples are with Jesus after he's been resurrected, they recognize him when they break bread together at this meal that they were told to remember. They remember him in the breaking of the bread. And as we gather around this table, as we break bread together, we do so as those who hold on tightly to that promise and that reality of resurrection. For ourselves, for those that we have lost and have entered into an eternal reality that exists within God's love. And as we do so, we remember who we are. We remember who God is, and we remember who God has made us, and we remember that we are claimed by and included in and exist through the reality of love. Friends, we don't sugarcoat the pain that we feel as we joyfully proclaim resurrection reality. But we certainly do express gratitude for the ways in which God makes himself real to us as we lean into the hope and the promise of life that follows life.